Hurricane Yen on Corp Irrigers Áras Flanagan in Eliok or Soccer Guinioga. Couldn't Áras agus ma van Kayla Sivin Kid Mila Folshak or of Galier go Horace and Utrum. Is gone weakest letter margin a height as up na manach Tikinot or Hain agus Sivin. Ta on Áras Glakulish na banach Tisha. Har ma cean hain agus ar cean muinter na here. Agus mu de tuat aiger blian nua. Is ma gui de gach ein den agi agus ta herani gur dira on gui céine ta agam na muinter na here. Blian siacana, blian dokish agus blian raha. Your Excellency, Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, Excellencies Minister Flanagan, dear friends. It is my great pleasure to welcome you and your families to Áras and Uachtaráin. As we enter 2016, my wish for each one of you and the citizens of your countries is what I wish for the people of Ireland, a year of peace, prosperity and hope. And may I say how much I appreciate your good wishes, Your Excellency, Most Reverend Charles Brown, coming as they do from the representative of a world leader who is doing so much to invigorate the spirit of international cooperation. Indeed, from the role he played in the historic rapprochement between Cuba and the United States of America, through to his contribution to the debate on the climate change, his important journey to Africa, during which he exceptionally inaugurated the Jubilee of Mercy in Bangui, the capital of the Central African Republic, and all this for the year 2015 alone, Pope Francis has emerged on the international stage as a figure of benevolence, great eloquence, and outstanding diplomatic skill. He is also making his mark as a frank analyst of our failures, our challenges, and our possibilities too, as a global community on a vulnerable planet, a planet made vulnerable, as he put it most recently, often due to our indifference. His is a call, among others, for reflection on the principles that have guided and continue to guide our policies at home and abroad. Dear friends, the beginning of a new year is a time when it is usual for us to revisit the year that has passed. It is also a time that invites us to look forward as we rededicate ourselves to the service of our respective nations and peoples and to our shared commitments to international cooperation. So this morning I would like to reflect with you on some of the successes and failures of diplomacy in the past year and share a few thoughts on some of the collective challenges and possibilities that lie ahead of us. 2015 was a particularly good year for diplomacy, and some would even say a triumph for multilateralism. It will be remembered as the year when a new paradigm was forged on global sustainable development and a critical agreement sealed on climate change. These achievements represent wise and patient, perhaps as some would say even inspired contributions of a diplomatic kind. If I may start with the issue of climate, on which we now have near full agreement as to the facts, the urgency of our position, and of course our immense responsibility towards future generations. Indeed, the fight against global warming invites us, as the Prime Minister of India said in his address to the Paris Conference, to care for the world we shall not see. In July of last year, I had the pleasure of taking part at the invitation of President Hollande in one of the preliminary consultations held in the run-up to COP21, a conference entitled Consciences for Climate. Much of the discussion at that conference revolved around the ethical challenge posed by climate change and the revolution in consciousness it called forth. For all of us, there the questions were unequivocal. Yes, the scientific reality of climate change is now accepted. But can our generation effectively seize the problems we have inherited and respond to them creatively? Are we ready to depart from economic models that encourage trade-offs in favor of the present to the detriment of the future? Can we reconcile the fight against climate change and the right to development, claimed correctly by emerging countries? If we are to think globally and have global policy, is the theory of interest that has motivated the foreign policy of so many of our nations, not also the source of some of our greatest collective problems, be it in the areas of security, unfair trade, tied development aid, or global poverty. If we are to effectively implement the Paris Agreement, must we not open the categories within our theory of interest and prepare for a moral leap, such as will enable us to construct our policies transnationally on a normative basis? And can this new normative consensus, which humanity requires, not draw on a variety of philosophical sources, cultural systems, transcendent belief structures, while holding basic human rights as its bedrock? The universal, legally binding agreement that was adopted last month by the representatives of 196 countries at the COP21 in Paris gives us hope in the ability of multilateral diplomacy to make a new departure and to tackle such fundamental questions as I have posed. This agreement has created a momentum. It has kick-started a positive dynamic which will see world leaders meet up every 5 years to review and increase their national contributions. Yes, indeed, the COP21 has left a number of issues unresolved. That goes without saying. For example, it remains to be seen what the annual $100 billion financial mobilization in favor of poorer countries, starting in 2020, really entails, and how some Western countries who are struggling with debt will manage to deliver on their promise. Furthermore, while the 1.5 degrees Celsius target is very strong and a most welcome signal, it is still unclear how individual countries will effectively implement strategies to cut their carbon emissions so as to meet this ambitious target. Then, of course, as many commentators have noted, the Paris conference failed to put a global price on carbon. Yet, I believe that all of us here can agree that what was achieved in Paris is a great victory in the light of the disappointing failures of the past. This is a turning point in the climate crisis, a powerful, irreversible movement. We have an agreed framework for collective action. The climate justice movement is now global. So many of our citizens have already started to change their consumption patterns and forms of living. Thousands of cities, provinces, regions around the world have committed to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. We're entering a new era, an era of low carbon, with new geopolitical equilibriums in sight and huge opportunities for all countries, including the poorer ones, to develop wind and solar energy. Dear friends, today on our planet, about 800 million children, women and men, do not have enough food to eat. The principal source of their hunger is dire poverty exacerbated by gross inequalities, which scandalously continue to increase. Eradicating this poverty and its associated cortege of suffering is the greatest moral challenge we as a global community face. It is a challenge we have not met with an adequacy of mind and heart. I may ask, have we set ourselves free to ask why we have failed? What assumptions are at the root of our failure? The implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that relate to it is our historic chance to respond to this greatest of challenges. I had the honour of witnessing the adoption of this 2030 Agenda in New York last September, in what was one of the biggest ever gatherings of world leaders at the United Nations. The adoption of an ambitious new framework for global sustainable development is rightly held as another great achievement of multilateral diplomacy in 2015. It is an achievement to which the permanent representatives of both Kenya and Ireland made a valuable contribution as co-facilitators in the negotiations. And I take this opportunity to thank wholeheartedly again Ambassador David Donoghue for his great work throughout the final phase of the negotiations. But of course, these two agendas, agreed in 2015, the climate and the development ones, they are profoundly interrelated. So great is the impact of environmental degradation on our population's livelihoods Conversely, the ability to fight climate change effectively, that change hinges upon all of our states' capacity to uproot extreme poverty and other debilitating forms of insecurity and fear. The conclusion of a deal on climate was also essential to the Sustainable Development Goals, insofar as the legally binding dimension of the environmental goal gives a hard edge to the 2030 agenda. Importantly, this New York agenda provides us with a new universal paradigm for development. Indeed, while the previous generation of development goals, the Millennium Development Goals, were predicated on a rather traditional conception of North-South cooperation, with aid seen as flowing from rich to poorer countries, this agenda of 2015 is universal. Many have recognized that increased inequality, unemployment and indebtedness, with their ensuing poverty, mean that there is now, as I have put it in other speeches, a South within the North, while elements of the North have migrated to the South, where distorted models of development have conferred the benefits of economic growth, they have conferred them on an elite rather than the majority, and particularly women who suffer from exclusion. So, as with climate, this universal agenda for global development invites us to complete a shift in mindset and discourse. It is a proclamation of interdependence that calls on us to take part not just in the previous North-South conversation, but in a new conversation about our humanity itself and our collective future, for which a transformation is necessary. The 2030 agenda is also important in another important respect, in that it puts forward a holistic approach to development, emphasizing, I quote, that there can be no sustainable development without peace, and no peace without sustainable development. Thus, peace, political stability, and good government are recognized as a virtual fourth pillar of development policy, together with the economic, social, and environmental pillars. This creates a demand, gives us hope for the emergence of an integrated continuum of action at international level, stretching from the responses provided to emergency situations to the need to empower vulnerable communities for the long term. And if I may single out and welcome wholeheartedly the adoption of goal number 5, which proclaims the need to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. In several regions of the world, we've recently witnessed an appalling resurgent increase of violence against women and girls, often rooted in a hideous ideology of female inferiority. Ireland has been a strong supporter of the establishment of the new United Nations Women Agency. Indeed, gender equality is a principle of similar importance. It is an issue that should infuse all thinking on development. And may I highlight just a few other features of the New York and Paris agreements, features which I believe can inform our thinking on multilateral action more generally. Of particular value to the professional exercise of diplomacy is the successive method that both the negotiation of the 2030 agenda and COP21 have been. May I pay tribute to the work of Ban Ki-moon in laying the ground for the conference, to Pope Francis for his valuable contribution with Laudato Si, to the public debate on our relationship to our natural environment, to the French Minister for Foreign Affairs, Laurent Fabius, for making this issue one of his top priorities, and to French diplomats who engaged so skillfully with all of the participants and stakeholders both before and during the conference. It is my hope that the esprit de Paris will be emulated in the years to come, the ability of our diplomats to engage with multiple actors, not just state and institutional ones, but also, for example, non-governmental organizations, local authorities, cities, trade unions, as well as bodies representing the scientific community or the private sector. This ability is crucial to the development of new global partnerships on issues of significance for the whole of humanity. The lessons drawn from such collaborations can, I believe, contribute to a positive renewal and expansion of multilateralism, both in terms of the management of crisis and of long-term governance. Both the Paris and New York agreements, too, are also important advances from the point of view of democratic participation. I have consistently emphasised, since all those years ago, my time in Shannon, the need for policy making, foreign policy in particular, to be sourced in an open and robust democratic debate. I think that we can all rejoice in the fact that both the climate and development agendas have attracted huge public interest in all of our countries. The role of civil societies then will be crucial as we move on to the implementation phase and the delivery of both agreements. The voluntary pledges made by all participating countries in Paris are public, which should allow civil societies to hold their governments to account more easily. As for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, agreed in New York, they're fleshed out in 169 targets and will be soon complemented in March 2016 by indicators that can galvanise the participation, advocacy and action of citizens and NGOs as they monitor their government's actions in combating poverty and hunger. Of course, real progress on any of the issues of global significance that I have been mentioning, be it gender equality, hunger, climate change, is predicated upon the international community's ability to secure appropriate levels of funding. According to a recent report paid by the Joint Development Committee of the IMF and the World Bank, trillions, not billions, will be needed to fund our ambitious new programme for global development. This was the subject discussed last July during the Addis Ababa conference which preceded the New York summit. As we look at new ways of financing development, I believe that we should keep the issue of debt at the centre of our discussions. Ireland supports the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which recognises the need to assist developing nations in attaining long-term debt sustainability. Indeed, the unsustainable debt position of so many countries gravely undermines their capacity to plan and execute long-term development programs. No serious or plausible agreement on development can ignore debt management issues, and in particular the central question of the role of the state and its financial capacity. In that respect, the Addis Ababa conference did not dissipate those real concerns that are there at a possible over-reliance on the private sector rather than the state, and the implications of this when it comes to funding and delivering development. In a recent keynote address I had the honour of delivering to the 10th UNCTAD Debt Management Conference in Geneva last November, I suggested that each state should be given a mandate to ensure that core social goods are established as a matter of the first order of economic priority, and that the international institutional system should support such a prioritisation. I realise that this principle, of course, is contradicted at the present time by the policy and practice of a number of institutions. Yet I believe that the Sustainable Development Goals have quite a radical potential in that they provide a framework that might encourage governments to establish a social floor in the years ahead. This concept of a social floor should not be seen as any simplistic rejection of market economics. It is not, but rather it is the drawing of a distinction between that which constitutes the core social goods of sustainable development, sufficiency in food, health, housing, basic education, and participation, and those goods and services, on the other hand, which may appropriately be left to the mechanisms of the market to distribute. Only thus will be developed and developing nations alike be enabled to manage, as I put it, to find their own path in conditions of change to sufficiency and sustainable development. I illustrated that point in Geneva with the recent experience of Liberia, Guinea and Sierra Leone, countries that were forced to make a choice between funding the necessary infrastructure to respond to the Ebola crisis or continue to make interest repayments on debt. What is needed then is no less than a radical rethinking of the policies informing the structure of our multilateral system. More generally, this reform is required if the international system is to hope to connect to the goals and aspirations which it is putting forward in the field of development and climate change. The weak architecture it has at present is for resolving issues such as debt are insufficient. This is all the more pressing as these issues, everybody is now conceding, are essential to the achievement of the goals set forth in both New York and Paris. This time last year, in preparation for the post-development negotiations, the United Nations Secretary-General issued an important report entitled The Road to Dignity by 2030, Ending Poverty, Transforming All Lives and Protecting the Planet, in a short, powerful section entitled Making the United Nations Fit for Transformation. The Secretary-General stated that to deliver on the new agenda, we need a UN system, as he put it, that is relevant, innovative, agile, inclusive, coordinated, and results-oriented. A system, that he put it, is guided by universal human rights and international norms, integrates the UN normative frameworks with its operational activities, and is responsive to the differentiated needs of countries. End quote. A system that forges effective partnerships to leverage external partners' expertise, capacities, and resources. He concluded by suggesting, as he put it, that member states may wish to reinforce current actions being taken, as well as to take initiatives to ensure that the United Nations system is fit for purpose to support its new transformative agenda and achieve coordination and coherence of development actors at country level. That was Ban Ki-moon. I believe that the Secretary-General's diplomatic challenge is so relevant across the entire multilateral system. In a speech I gave in 2014 to the students of Shanghai's Fudan University, I suggested that existing institutional silos are not suitable for the achievement of universal goals in a global context. The music from them is very discordant. More coherent linkages, more harmonious and even original music is required between the different agencies. Of course, interinstitutional cooperation is fundamental, not just at international level, but also at the national level. For all of you know very well, fragmentation at UN level often mirrors a lack of integration between government departments, between states, within states too. But of course we need to go much further. Beyond the necessary reshuffling of our multilateral institutional architecture, we must look at the theory and scholarship that underpins the actions of our diplomats on the international stage. Foreign policy implemented through diplomacy is based on assumptions within scholarship. How open citizens across the planet might ask, is that scholarship? What price might they ask? Have they paid, and will future generations pay, for false certainties, the pursuit of narrow interests, distortions of thought and history? We must not allow ourselves to forget that the unresolved issues of global poverty, food insecurity, desertification, unsustainable levels of debt, distorted trade, abuses of power, by commission or omission, they are the legacy of paradigms of thought and practice that have failed and continue to fail us as a global community. Over the past year, I've had the benefit of having valuable conversations on this topic with Kofi Annan, Ban Ki-moon, and Jim Yong Kim, the President of the World Bank. And I must say that all of my visitors shared my concern at the threat to what we all hope for now, indeed to democracy itself, that is posed by the expansion of all that is unaccountable in our world. Indeed, if we are to achieve any of our global goals, we must seek to define new models that are accountable, transparent, and rooted in democratic participation. Meanwhile, we cannot indulge any illusion that those who hold unaccountable power will surrender it to the people without intellectual and moral confrontation or struggle. The notion of global citizenship, if it is to gain substance, requires the strategic organization and informed participation of our citizens into discourse and decision-making. The age of open foreign policy, of accountable multilateral diplomacy, of a revitalized normative theory for collective action, that is upon us. Of course, the pursuit of a better world requires good faith, authenticity of language, a genuine commitment to human dignity. And I refer specifically to the need to put an end to any and all of our ambivalence in relation to the implementation of human rights. The reduction of human rights to a mere rhetorical instrument of political abuse is immensely harmful to the credibility of the human rights system and to the legitimacy of those states who resort to such a distorted usage. How can the sponsoring of conflicts, the injection of death and displacement, the destruction of livelihood in the name of any ethnicity, belief or origin ever be justified? Isn't it the task of foreign policy, of diplomats, of our publics, to rightly ask, to relentlessly confront those who instrumentalize surrogate conflicts and pay at best lip service to human rights? Our collective action on the international stage must be predicated on sound philosophical foundations: dignity, justice and truth. These are not hollow words. And the New York summit was at its best when it invoked a spirit of leaving nobody behind. And at the Paris talks, they were grounded on good science. Truth won out over the funds of the powerful, the lobbying of vested interests, and the bogus science that came together and converged in an attempt to negate the reality of global warming and block our response to it. So we've arrived at a crucial juncture of our lives together. Previous models of governance and economics taken for granted are disintegrating. Prevailing forms of living, of extraction and use of resources, of trade, they are now revealed to threaten not just our natural environment, but social cohesion itself. Excellencies, dear friends, our world is one of shifting complexity. Indeed, it is becoming ever more complex. And as we begin 2016, we are faced with challenges that are now interacting: population expansion, migration, changing trade conditions, commodity depreciation and price, and the current economic downturn, which is impacting particularly hard on emerging countries and may mitigate their ability to deliver on their international commitments. These are all issues that create a challenging context for the year ahead. We remain confronted across the world with dramatic situations of conflict that, if not addressed, these conflicts will continue to generate unspeakable human suffering and might also put at naught our collective efforts in what I've been speaking about in the spheres of climate change, poverty and hunger. Therefore, we must, in the coming months, try again, acknowledging where we have failed, dedicate all our efforts to finding solutions to the ongoing wars in Syria and Iraq, but also to the most worrying escalation of tensions once again in the Great Lakes region, and in particular in Burundi, not to mention, of course, Ukraine, Nigeria, South Sudan, Libya, Pakistan, Turkey, and in so many other places where peace is fragile. This is a daunting task, and I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the work which all of you as diplomats perform on a daily basis, the work of those who seek to build friendships between peoples, who tirelessly weave peaceful, collective resolutions to the root causes of conflicts. This work is of immense importance and should be celebrated, and I acknowledge it this morning and I celebrate it. For when we look back at 2015, who among us should not be haunted by the memory of the horrific slaughter of so many defenseless people in terrorist attacks across Africa, Europe and the Middle East? These new forms of violence are extremely difficult to tackle, arising as they do in the obscure intersection of geopolitical tensions, individual trajectories and beliefs, complex structures of social inequalities, and globalized passions that prosper on feelings of hopelessness, resentment, humiliation, or the search for glory or significance. The combining of fanaticism and technology has generated what Ulrich Beck has called a globalization of emotion as a most powerful driver of global disorder and conflict. This poses a particularly difficult challenge for diplomacy. As pointed out by political scientist Pierre Hasnett, global passions, and particularly negative ones, are such a powerful force in international relations that diplomacy can never afford to overlook them. And this means, among other things, that the international community must be wary of undertaking actions, or to allow for the undertaking thereof, or in loose language, anything that might exacerbate destructive collective feelings of resentment or humiliation. Let us reflect on the legacy we have inherited. Multinational, multilateral negotiation must always prevail over unilateral intervention, and in particular military intervention. As I conclude, may I draw your attention to yet another destructive passion that is taking root in far too many of our societies. Fear. We know the extreme perils encapsulated in fear. We remember how the manipulation of collective fears has in the past led to such horrendous events as so-called preventative genocides. Let us together take every possible action to prevent fear from becoming a driver of our responses to global challenges. And I'm thinking in particular of our response to the great migration crisis that defines the contemporary moment. To give protection, food, shelter to those who are fleeing war, oppression or starvation is a matter of fundamental, universal solidarity. The refusal to do so goes beyond that remarkable phrase coined by Pope Francis, the globalization of indifference, as indifference is slowly turning into mistrust and hostility. I thank you, Dean, for your references to the Irish Navy, and I'm proud to say that the Irish government voluntarily opted into the relocation process of asylum seekers put forward by the European Commission. Indeed, as Your Excellency has already mentioned, Ireland has sent a succession of naval vessels to the Mediterranean, allowing for the rescue of approximately 8,500 people in the last 6 months. Yet here, as everywhere across Europe, the initial upsurge of emotion and generosity is always in danger of giving way to a more apprehensive atmosphere. We must hold firm in our solidarity. The risk is not just that this refugee crisis has the potential to undermine Schengen, as the media reports it, and the principle of free circulation within the European Union. It has the potential to undermine the values that we invoke as constituting the basis of the humanistic spirit to which Europeans recommitted themselves after the devastation of World War II. The issue of migration touches upon some of the most divisive and sensitive aspects of European identity. Our relationship to the outside world, to the South, as it has been called, of the world, and to the Muslim world. And again, I would, with humility, urge all of our European ambassadors here to do everything that is in their power to ensure that this crisis becomes an opportunity to rekindle a European ethos of human dignity, freedom and solidarity. An opportunity, perhaps, to forge a coherent common policy on asylum. I urge them to give meaning to that most shared concept across all belief systems and cultures, that concept that is in all of them, hospitality, which is interpreted in most religions and cultures as care for the stranger, not yet a friend. Excellencies, dear friends, as we begin this new year with hope and anticipation, may I thank you all once again for the vital role you perform in fostering understanding and cooperation between nations. I wish also to recognize and acknowledge the support which you receive from your loved ones in this important work. And both Sabine and I were so pleased to welcome members of your family. In this year, when indeed, as you have said, Dean, Ireland is celebrating the centenary of those founding events of our independence, please convey the good wishes of the Irish people to all those that you represent so well. And now I would like to propose a toast to the heads of state here represented. Ba Banach.